The stain was the size of a plum, dark at its heart and rusted at its edges, and it sat just below the left shoulder of the gown, as if someone had wanted to be sure it would not be missed. Wren held the fabric up to the window and counted, because counting was what she did when her hands wanted to shake. 1 breath. 2, 3 seams that would need to be turned, 4 hours until the carriages would be called to the courtyard below, and only 1 gown between her and the long table where the Duke of Isselmary would sit tonight in the great banqueting hall of Ashenford Keep. She did not cry. She had not cried since she was 12, and she was not going to start over a plum. She lowered the gown and laid it across the trunk at the foot of the narrow bed, smoothing it flat as if smoothing it might undo what had been done to it, and then she looked, without meaning to, at the closed door behind her. On the other side of that door, in the corridor of the West Wing, she could hear her cousins laughing. She knew their laughter the way a shepherd knows his own dogs. Cassia's was bright and quick. A bell struck twice. Marin's was lower, warmer at first sound, colder if you listened for a second longer. They were laughing now, and they were laughing near her door on purpose, and Wren, who had grown up in that house since she was 9, understood the arithmetic of that laughter as clearly as she understood the arithmetic of the stain. It had been Marin's gown, once a pale silver green, the color of the underside of an olive leaf, cut long in the sleeve and high at the throat, made for a girl a hand taller than Wren, and a whole world more expected. Marin had worn it twice, decided it did not flatter her, and passed it down to the cousin who lived under their roof, and ate at the low end of their table, and taught their little brother his letters when the tutor's fees came due. Wren had accepted it the way she accepted everything from them, which was to say with a small, level bow of the head that gave nothing away. She had spent 2 evenings taking in the shoulders and shortening the hem, and she had hung it herself in the little press behind the door, and now here it was on the trunk, with a plum-shaped stain at the collarbone and a smell of red wine still faint on the fabric. And outside her door, the 2 of them were laughing as if the whole matter were a joke they had told well. She had a few seconds to decide. She could open the door and ask them plainly, and they would widen their eyes and tell her some soft, careful lie about a maid in a tray and how sorry, how terribly sorry, and Aunt Heloise, when told, would sigh and say that Wren must simply stay behind tonight. It could not be helped. One could not present oneself to a duke in a stained gown. One had to be reasonable. One had to know one's place. Or she could not ask. She could not open the door at all. She could turn back to the trunk and to the plum and to the 4 hours she had left, and she could see what a girl who had learned to mend by candlelight could do with a ruined thing. Wren chose the trunk. She lifted the gown again and carried it to the little table by the window, where the afternoon light came in weak and gray from a sky that was thinking about rain. She had, in the bottom of that trunk, a folded square of dark silver ribbon that had belonged to her mother, kept for no reason she could ever quite say. She had a needle. She had thread the color of the underside of an olive leaf, because she had bought it herself for the mending. She had, if she was careful with the salt and the cold water and the small, patient rubbing, some hope of lifting the worst of the wine before she covered what remained. She sat down. She threaded the needle by the light of the window. She began. Down in the courtyard, a groom was calling to another groom about a lame horse. Somewhere along the corridor, a door opened and shut. The laughter of her cousins moved off, satisfied, in the direction of the stair. Wren did not look up. Her hands were steady now, which was a thing she had learned to do on purpose, and she bent her head over the plum and set to work. The stain was the size of a plum, and she was the size of a girl who had been underestimated in that house for 11 years, and she had a few seconds, and then a few minutes, and then a few hours, and she meant to use them. She had come to Ashenford in the wet autumn of her 9th year, with a small wooden box tied in twine and a letter of introduction her father had written the night before he died. Her mother had gone 2 winters before that, quietly, of a cough that would not go, and her father had followed her the way certain men follow certain women, without much fuss and without much delay. The letter had asked his wife's sister, Lady Heloise of Ashenford, to take the child in for the sake of blood, and Lady Heloise had read the letter twice, folded it into her sleeve, and taken the child in for the sake of blood and no other reason at all. Wren had understood that from the first supper, when she had been placed at the low end of the long table and given the smaller cup. She had understood it more clearly at the first 12th night, when Cassia and Marin had been dressed in new blue and she in Marin's outgrown yellow, taken in at the waist by a maid who clicked her tongue at the poor fit. She had understood it most of all in the schoolroom, where the tutor had come 3 days a week for the 2 daughters of the house and been paid extra. Once, at Lady Heloise's suggestion, to let the niece sit at the back if she was quiet. Wren had been quiet. She had also, without anyone quite noticing, been faster than her cousins at Latin and better at accounts, and by the time she was 13, correcting the tutor when he misquoted Virgil. The tutor had not liked being corrected by a girl in an outgrown yellow dress, and he had said so once to Lady Heloise, and Lady Heloise had told Wren that a clever tongue was not a womanly ornament and that she would do well to keep hers behind her teeth. Wren had kept it behind her teeth. She had also, in the years since, kept a great many other things behind her teeth, and she had, in the small hours when the house was sleeping, taught herself things no one had thought to teach her. She had read her uncle's ledgers when she was 15, because she was curious how a house of Ashenford's size could be always short of coin, and she had understood by 16 that her uncle owed money in 3 directions and had been paying interest to a 4th for so long that the debt had children of its own. She had read her uncle's letters when they came, not out of malice, but out of the same steady curiosity, and she had learned the names of the men to whom Ashenford owed, and the sums, and the dates by which those sums would come due, and she had, without ever meaning to become a keeper of secrets, become the only person in the house who understood what was actually holding its roof up. She had also, in the same small hours, taught herself needlework of a kind her aunt would have called excessive. Not the sampler and cushion sort that Cassia produced with a sigh and Marin with a shrug, but the real thing, the sort a seamstress in a city would charge 2 silvers for, the sort that could turn a plum-shaped stain into a spray of silver leaves along a collarbone if a girl had 4 hours and a steady hand. She had never told anyone she could do it. She had mended for the house because she was asked, and she had mended plainly, and she had let the maids take the credit when the mending was praised, because a girl in an outgrown yellow dress learned early that a talent shown too clearly in that house was a talent that was taken. Now she sat at the little table by the window with an olive-leaf gown across her knees, and she worked. She rubbed the stain first with cold water and a pinch of salt from the small cracked dish she kept for her own porridge, patient, the way her mother had once shown her at a kitchen table she could barely remember. The worst of the wine lifted, a ghost of it remained, a shadow the shape of a plum, and Wren considered the shadow the way a general considers a hill he cannot take by force and must therefore go around. She threaded the silver, and she began, at the collarbone, to embroider a branch. A single stem, curving down from the shoulder seam, and from the stem small pointed leaves in the color of the gown itself, so that they lay almost hidden against the silver green, and among the leaves, at intervals she chose with care, small buds in the darker silver of her mother's ribbon, unraveled thread by thread. The plum-shaped shadow, when she had finished with it, would be a cluster of buds waiting to open. No one, unless they knew what had been there, would know what had been there. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that hurry showed in the stitch, and that a stitch that showed hurry could not be undone by any amount of wishing later. She let her breath settle. She let the light do what the light would do. She counted when her hands wanted to shake, and her hands, more and more, did not want to shake. Somewhere below, a bell was rung for the afternoon, and she did not answer it. Somewhere below, Aunt Heloise was calling for hot water and for the hairdresser and for someone, anyone, to find Kasaya's second pair of slippers. And Wren, at her little table, drew one small silver leaf, and then another, and did not look up. The message that she was expected to attend the banquet had come only 2 days before, and it had come the way most things came to Wren, which was sideways. Aunt Heloise had swept into the small parlor where Wren was mending a torn cuff of Uncle Osric's, and she had stopped just inside the door and looked at her niece with the particular expression she wore when she had been forced by circumstance into a generosity she did not feel. The Duke of Iselmere, she said, was to sup at Ashenford on the night of the feast of St. Aveline. He was traveling south to the coast and had chosen to break his journey here, and Uncle Osric had accepted the honor with the pleasure it deserved. The whole household would attend. The whole household, she repeated, and did not quite meet Wren's eye. Wren had lowered the cuff to her lap and said quietly that she would be glad of it, and had not asked why she, who at every previous banquet had been left in the schoolroom with the little cousin, was suddenly included in the whole. She had not needed to ask. She had, only that morning, been passing the door of her uncle's study, and she had heard her uncle say, in the low voice men use when they are asking something they do not want to be heard asking, that the Duke of Iselmere was known to admire a lively table and a full one, and that a house presenting only 2 marriageable daughters to a man of his standing would look thin, and that Wren, for all her plainness, made a 3rd body at the table and a 3rd curtsy at the door. Uncle Osric had said the word plainness the way one says the word weather, not unkindly, only accurately, and Wren, on the other side of the door, had let the word land where it landed and had walked on. She was not plain. She was not beautiful in the way Cassia was, in the way that made grooms drop reins and merchants forget their arithmetic, and she was not striking in the way Marin was, all dark brow and slow smile, but she was not plain either. She was, she thought, the sort of face a person had to look at twice to see, and she had made her peace with the fact that most people in her life had never bothered with the second look. Now, at the little table by the window, threading silver through olive-leaf silk, she thought about the Duke of Iselmere. She had heard of him the way one heard of weather in a distant country. He was young, but not so young as to be foolish. He had come into his title 3 years ago after his elder brother had died in a hunting accident, and he had, by all accounts, taken up the running of Iselmere with a quiet competence that had surprised those who had expected a second son's carelessness. He was said to be tall, and said to be plain-spoken, and said, more interestingly, to have a habit of reading his own ledgers, which was a thing dukes were not supposed to do. Wren, who read her uncle's ledgers, had filed this last detail away with a small, private interest, and had not thought about him again until Aunt Heloise had swept into the parlor. She thought about him now, and she thought about the ledgers she had read that morning by candlelight when the house was still asleep, and she thought about a certain letter she had found tucked into the 3rd ledger, folded small, addressed to Uncle Osric in a hand she did not know, and stamped with a seal she had recognized because she had seen it, once, on a proclamation nailed to the market cross in the town. The seal of Iselmere. The letter had been dated 4 months ago and had been a polite but exact request that a debt of 2,000 crowns, owed by the House of Ashenford to a merchant consortium, in which the Duke of Iselmary held the greater share, be repaid on or before the feast of St. Aveline, failing which the Duke would be obliged, with regret, to consider other means of recovery. Wren had refolded the letter and put it back where she had found it, and she had walked down the corridor to her own room and stood at her own window for a long time, and she had understood, then, why the whole household was to attend the banquet, and why she, plain third body, was to be a third curtsy at the door. It was not a supper, it was a court. The Duke of Iselmary was breaking his journey at Ashenford not because he admired a lively table, but because he intended to look, personally, at the house that owed him 2,000 crowns, and to decide, personally, whether it was worth waiting or worth taking. Uncle Osric knew this. Aunt Heloise knew this. Cassiah and Marin, Wren was almost certain, did not. What her cousins knew was that a young unmarried duke was coming to their door, and what they intended, with the certainty of girls who had never been refused anything, was that one of them would leave the table promised. That was why the plum had happened. Wren understood this now with a clarity that felt almost restful. The stained gown had not been an accident of a careless maid. It had been a small, calculated closing of a door. If Wren went down in a stained gown, she would not go down at all. She would be quietly kept back, and the field for the evening would belong to the two of them. She lowered the needle and looked, for a moment, at the row of silver leaves she had made. She thought about the letter in the third ledger. She thought about the word plainness and about the word weather. She threaded a fresh length of silver, and she began, at the base of the branch, another leaf. The rain that had been thinking about arriving arrived. It came down against the leaded window in small tapping runs, and the light in the little room, already gray, went grayer. Wren lit the stub of candle on the table and worked on. She had, by the time the second bell of the afternoon was rung, finished the branch and the leaves and the first cluster of buds, and she had begun on the second, and the plum-shaped shadow was, from more than a hand's breadth away, no longer visible at all. She had also, without meaning to, begun to hum. It was an old air, one her mother had sung at the kitchen table over the salt and the water, and she had not sung it aloud since she was a child, but the humming rose in her throat as her hands settled, and she let it rise. She did not hear the door open. She heard, instead, the small, startled intake of breath from the doorway, and she looked up. It was not Cassia. It was not Marin. It was Perrin, the little cousin, 6 years old and barefoot in the corridor and holding, against his nightshirt, a wooden horse missing one ear. Perrin was the small catalyst of that house, though nobody in it would have called him such. He had been born late, an afterthought to a couple who had been done with children, and he had been raised, in effect, by the maids and by Wren. He came to Wren's room the way a cat comes to a warm hearth, without asking, and he stood now in the doorway, with his wooden horse held to his chest, and looked at the gown across her knees, and then at her face, and then at the gown again. Cassia said, he told her, that you weren't coming down tonight. He said it the way a child says a thing he has been told and does not believe. Wren set the needle carefully into the fabric so as not to lose her place. She said, quietly, that Cassia had been mistaken. Perrin considered this. He came into the room, in the sideways way he had, and he climbed onto the trunk at the foot of her bed and sat there with his horse in his lap and his feet not touching the floor. He looked at the gown for a long moment. He said, "That's pretty." He said it flatly, in the way children say what they see. Wren thanked him, she asked, without looking up, whether he had eaten his supper. He said he had not. because Nurse was helping with Cassia's hair and had forgotten him, and Wren, without breaking the rhythm of her stitch, told him where in the little press behind the door he would find a heel of bread and an apple she had put by that morning for exactly this reason. He got up to fetch them, and he brought them back to the trunk, and he ate them there, watching her work. He was quiet for a long time in the way only certain children can be quiet. Then he said, "Is the Duke as tall as they say?" Wren said she did not know. He said, "Is he as fierce?" She said she did not know that either. He said, "Are you afraid?" She stopped at that, and she looked at him properly for the first time since he had come in. He was 6 and barefoot and holding a horse missing one ear, and he was asking her the only question in the house that anyone had thought to ask her. She said, "No." She said it evenly, and she did not embellish it, and she let it stand. Perrin nodded, satisfied, and went back to his apple. Outside, the rain thickened. Somewhere below, Aunt Heloise was calling for someone to bring the second lamp to the great hall, and for someone else to see that the north fires were built up, and for someone, urgently, to find Cassia's second pair of slippers, which had apparently, mysteriously, gone missing. Wren, who had put them that morning under Cassia's own bed as a small, quiet joke to herself, did not smile. She set another leaf. Perrin, chewing, said, "If I hide under your chair at supper, will you feed me pieces?" Wren said she would. He said, "Promise," she said. "Promise," he said. "Good," and finished his apple, and slid down from the trunk and padded out of the room and away down the corridor, and Wren went back to her branch. When she next looked up, the light at the window had shifted from gray to the deeper gray that meant the afternoon was gone. She had, along the shoulder of the gown, a spray of silver leaves and silver buds like something from a story, and where the plum had been there was, instead, the loveliest thing on the fabric. She stood, carefully, and shook the gown out, and she held it up to the candle. It was beautiful. It was not the beauty of Cassia's gown, or Marin's, or any of the beauties Aunt Heloise would have approved of at a glance. It was quieter than that, and more particular, and it was, unmistakably, hers. She laid it across the bed. She washed her hands in the basin. She went to the small glass on the wall, and looked, for a moment, at her own face, at the face that had to be looked at twice, and she did not flinch from it. She took down her hair, and she braided it plainly, and she coiled the braid at the nape of her neck the way her mother had once worn hers. She had no jewels. She had, in the bottom of the little wooden box that had come with her from her father's house 11 years before, a pair of small silver drops that had been her mother's, and she put them in her ears. She put on the gown. It fit her. It had always fit her since the 2 evenings of taking in, but tonight, with the silver leaves along the shoulder, it fit her in a way that felt less like wearing a cousin's cast-off and more like wearing something that had been made for the woman she had become without anyone in the house noticing. She stood in the middle of the little room and let out a breath, and she thought, absurdly, of Perrin's question. "Are you afraid?" She had said no. She had said no because it was true. She was many things, standing there in silver green with her mother's earrings and 11 years of a certain kind of silence behind her, but afraid was not one of them. The great hall of Ashenford had been a great hall since the time of the third king, and Uncle Osric had spent a portion of his last 5 years, and a portion of money he did not have, making it look like a great hall again. The long table had been polished. The banners along the north wall had been beaten and rehung. The fires at both ends had been built up until the room smelled of applewood and warmth, and the candles along the length of the table had been lit, 72 of them. Wren counted as she came in, because counting was still what she did when her hands wanted to shake. The Duke of Isilmere was already there. He was standing at the hearth at the far end of the room with his back half to the door, in conversation with Uncle Osric, and the first thing Wren noticed about him was that he was indeed tall. The second was that he did not stand like a man who wished you to notice how tall he was. He stood easily, one hand at his side, the other resting on the mantel, and he was listening to Uncle Osric with an attention that Uncle Osric was clearly not accustomed to receiving. He was not in his court dress. He was in a plain, dark coat of good cut and no ornament, and his hair, dark and cut short, was still faintly damp from the rain. He looked, Wren thought, less like a duke than like a man who happened to be a duke, which was, if she had had to guess earlier, exactly what she would have guessed. Cassiah was already at her post at the middle of the room, in blue, and Marin was in dark red at her elbow, and Aunt Heloise was hovering behind them with the particular fixed smile she wore for occasions of consequence. When Wren stepped into the light of the door, Aunt Heloise's smile did not so much fall as freeze. She had, Wren saw, expected the door to remain closed. She had expected the maid to come down in a minute or two with the regretful news that the niece was unwell and would not be joining them tonight. She had not expected the niece to walk in silver green with silver leaves at her shoulder and her mother's earrings and her chin at the level she had learned to keep it at. Cassiah turned. Cassiah looked. Cassiah's mouth opened, very slightly, and closed. Marin, quicker, glanced once at the shoulder of Wren's gown and once at Cassiah's face and understood, in that one glance, that whatever they had done that afternoon had not, in the event, worked. She recovered first. She smiled warmly and said, "Oh, Wren, how lovely," and Wren, who had grown up on the exact temperature of Marin's smiles, thanked her at the exact temperature required, and no warmer. Aunt Heloise recovered next. She stepped forward and said in the smooth voice she used for company, "Come, come, we must present you," and she took Wren by the elbow with a grip that was firmer than affection required and steered her down the length of the hall toward the hearth. The Duke had turned. He had turned at the sound of the door, and he had watched, without making a show of it, the small, silent play that had passed between the three cousins, and he was watching now as Aunt Heloise brought the third of them toward him. His eyes, Wren registered at 10 paces, were not the eyes of a man who missed things. They were gray and clear and settled, and they went first, as courtesy required, to Aunt Heloise, and then, as the introduction was made, to Wren. He bowed. He bowed to her exactly as he had bowed, Wren was certain, to Cassiah and Marin, which was to say correctly and without excess, and Wren curtsied exactly as she had been taught to curtsy 11 years ago in a schoolroom in the back, and their eyes met for the length of time that was proper and no longer. He said, "Miss Wren," in a voice that was low and unhurried. She said, "Your Grace." That was all. Aunt Heloise, satisfied that the third curtsy had been made, drew Wren aside with the same firm grip and installed her at the seat that had been chosen for her, which was, of course, at the far end of the table, next to the elderly widowed cousin of Uncle Osric, who was deaf in one ear and did not care which. Wren took her seat without protest. She unfolded her napkin. She looked, briefly, along the length of the polished table, and she counted, again, the candles, and she waited to see what kind of night it would be. It was then that the Duke of Iselmary, who had been walking with Uncle Osric to the head of the table, stopped. He stopped at the chair that had been laid for him at the head, and he looked, without hurry, down the length of the table, and he said, in the same low, unhurried voice, that he would prefer, if his host would indulge him, to have Miss Wren beside him this evening. There was a silence. It was not a long silence, but it was long enough for Wren to hear the tap of the rain on the high windows and the soft settling of a log in the north fire, and for Aunt Heloise's fixed smile to freeze a second time. Uncle Osric, who had spent 30 years in company and knew when to move quickly, said of course, and gestured to a servant. A place was moved. A chair was drawn out. Kassia's face at the middle of the table did something quick and small that Wren did not permit herself to look at directly. Marin's face did nothing at all, which was, if you knew Marin, worse. Aunt Heloise's mouth said, "How gracious," and her eyes said something else entirely. Wren rose from her seat next to the deaf cousin. She walked at the pace one walks in a gown one has embroidered oneself in the last 4 hours of one's own life, up the length of the polished table. The Duke, standing, drew out the chair beside his own. She sat. He sat. The soup was brought. Under the table, she folded her hands once, tightly, and then unfolded them, and she picked up her spoon, and she did not look at him, and she did not look at him, and the banquet began. He did not, at first, speak to her. He spoke to Uncle Osric, and to the abbot from the town who was on his other side, and he spoke of the roads and of the coast, and of a small matter of a bridge in the north that Uncle Osric had not known about. And Wren listened as she had always listened, which was closely and quietly, and while eating her soup. He did not, she noticed, drink wine. He had allowed a cup to be poured for him, and he had raised it once for the toast, and he had set it down again, and taken water from the ewer. And Wren, who had been taught by her uncle's ledgers to notice what a man declined, she noticed also that he ate slowly and finished what was put before him, and that he spoke to the servant who brought the second course by name, having asked the name at the first, and that he did not laugh at any of Uncle Osric's 3 prepared jokes, but smiled at each of them with a warmth so exact that Uncle Osric felt himself to have been laughed with. Wren, watching this from 3 feet away, understood that she was seated next to a man who had learned, very young and very thoroughly, to make other men comfortable while giving nothing away, and she understood, further, that the reason he had asked for her at his elbow was not yet clear and would not become clear until he chose. She waited. The second course was cleared. The third was brought. It was in the small lull between the third and the fourth that he turned to her, at last, without turning his shoulders, and said, quietly, so that Uncle Osric on his other side did not hear, that the embroidery on her gown was uncommonly fine. Wren, who had been raising her cup, set it down again. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He said, still quietly, "Was it done here?" She said, "Yes," he said. "By whom?" She said, "By me." He absorbed this the way he had absorbed the matter of the bridge in the north, without visible reaction. And then he said, "This afternoon." It was not a question. Wren looked at him then, properly, for the first time since she had sat down. His gray eyes were on hers, calm and interested and without any of the amusement she had braced herself for, and she understood that he had seen, at 10 paces at the hearth, what she had done with the plum, and that he had understood at 10 paces at the hearth what it meant. She said, "Yes, this afternoon." He said, softly, "Well." That was all. He turned back to the abbot and asked him a question about the bridge, and Wren picked up her cup and drank from it, and her hands, she noticed with a small distant surprise, were entirely steady. From that point in the evening, the shape of the thing changed, though no one at the table but the 2 of them would have been able to say how. He returned to her between courses. He asked her, in the same low, unhurried voice, whether she had lived at Ashenford long, and she said, "Since I was 9. He asked her whether she had been taught by a tutor, and she said, "In a way." He asked her, with the smallest lift at the corner of his mouth, what "in a way" meant, and she said, evenly that she had been taught what her cousins were taught, from a seat at the back of the room, on the days she was permitted to sit in, and that she had taught herself the rest. He was quiet at that for the length of a breath. Then he asked her, without warning, what she had taught herself, and Wren, who had spent 11 years not answering that question, answered it. She said Latin, she said French, she said some Greek. She said arithmetic beyond what a girl is meant to know, and enough of the law of the realm to read a contract, and enough of husbandry to know when a bailiff is lying about a herd. She said it all quietly, and she said it without pride, and she said it while cutting a piece of pheasant into pieces small enough for a 6-year-old who had, as promised, wedged himself under the tablecloth at her feet, and was accepting the pieces with the patience of an old bargain. The Duke, who had noticed the pheasant leaving her plate at intervals and going nowhere he could see, glanced once at the tablecloth and once at her face and said nothing. He asked her, instead, how one told when a bailiff was lying about a herd. Wren told him. She told him about the discrepancy between the count and the tallow returns, and about the way a bailiff who was skimming would always over-report losses in a hard winter and under-report births in a soft spring, and about the small, patient work of matching one ledger to another over 3 years to catch him at it. She told him quietly, without looking up from her plate, and she told him because he had asked, and because, for the first time in 11 years, someone had asked. He listened. He listened the way he had listened to Uncle Osric, which was to say completely. When she had finished, he was silent for a moment, and then he said, in the same low voice, Miss Wren, "May I ask you something?" She said, "Of course." He said, "Has your uncle's bailiff been skimming?" Wren, cutting another small piece of pheasant, said, "Yes." She said it without any change of expression, and she passed the piece down under the tablecloth to a small, waiting hand, and she said for 4 years, though he has been more careful in the last 2. The Duke was silent again. Then he said, quietly, "Thank you." He turned back to Uncle Osric, and he asked him a question about the north wing of the house, and Wren went on eating her pheasant, and Perrin under the table went on eating his, and the 4th course was brought, and the rain went on tapping at the high windows, and the candles burned steadily down, and the evening moved on. It was between the 5th course and the 6th that he asked her, without turning his head, whether she had read a certain letter that had been sent to her uncle 4 months previously. He asked it so quietly that she was the only person at the table who heard, and she understood, at once, that he had chosen the moment because a servant was clearing a dish between them, and the noise of it covered the words. She did not pretend not to understand. She said, "Yes," he said. "All of it," she said. "Twice," he said. "And did you understand it?" She said, "Yes," he said. "And did your uncle discuss it with you?" She almost smiled at that, and did not. She said, "No, Your Grace, my uncle does not discuss his ledgers with the niece who reads them by candlelight when he is asleep." There was, at that, the smallest movement at the corner of the Duke's mouth. And then it was gone. He said, "And what would you tell me if I asked you about the state of this house's affairs?" Wren set down her knife. She folded her hands in her lap, out of sight of the table. She spoke, in the low, even voice she had used with him all evening, and she told him. She told him the sum of the debt to his consortium, and the sums of the 2 other debts her uncle carried, and the rate of interest on each, and the name of the 4th creditor, whose interest was still being paid, and whose principal had not been touched in 6 years. She told him the honest income of the estate, and she told him the dishonest one, and she told him what the bailiff had been taking, and she told him what could be recovered if the bailiff were replaced by an honest man and given 3 good years. She told him what she thought her uncle could pay this Michaelmas and what he could not, and she told him, without softening it, that if the 2,000 crowns were demanded in full on the feast of St. Avelin, the house would be sold before Candlemas. She said all of this to the folded napkin in her lap, because it was easier than saying it to his face, and when she had finished, she did not look up. She waited. The 6th course was brought. The Duke thanked the servant and asked her name, and remembered it. When the servant had gone, he said, very quietly, Miss Wren. She looked up. His gray eyes were on her, and they were not, she saw, the eyes of a creditor. They were the eyes of a man who had listened and understood and made, in the space of a course, a decision. He said, I do not intend to demand the 2,000 crowns on the feast of St. Aveline, he said. I intend to send an honest steward to your uncle in the spring at my own expense, for the 3 good years you spoke of, on the condition that the accounts of the estate are, from this Michaelmas forward, kept and reviewed by a person of my choosing. She said, quietly, that would save the house. He said, yes. He said, that is why I am doing it. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, and the person of my choosing, if she will have the work, is you. Wren did not speak. She could not, for a moment, have spoken. She looked, very carefully, at the candle in front of her, at the small, steady flame of it, and she counted 1 to 3 in her head, and then she looked at him. She said, Your Grace, he said, I have watched you all evening. He said it without ornament, in the same low voice he had used all night, and it was not a compliment in the sense a girl of Cassia's temperament would have understood it. It was a statement of what he had done. He had watched her enter in a repaired gown. He had watched her curtsy at the exact depth required, and no lower. He had watched her feed a child under a tablecloth, without breaking the rhythm of a sentence about husbandry. He had watched her name a bailiff's fraud in 3 sentences, and the state of a house's ruin in a paragraph, without malice, without pleasure, and without a single misstatement he could catch. He said, I did not come here for a wife. He said it plainly, and she almost laughed, and did not. He said, but I came here in need of a steward for a matter I cannot entrust to any of my own household, and I did not expect to find her at your uncle's table. He said, I do not ask lightly. I ask because the work is real and because you can do it. He said, will you consider it? Wren said, yes. She said it without hesitation, because there was, in that moment, no hesitation in her. She said, I will consider it. And then, more quietly, she said, I do not need long. He said, take until the morning. She said, I will. He said, good. And then, in a voice that was still low, but had, for the first time all evening, something almost like warmth in it, he said, and now, Miss Wren, tell me about the branch on your shoulder. Was it invented, or is it from a plant I ought to know? Wren looked at him. She said, olive. He said, ah, she said. My mother's people came from the south. He said, ah, again, and this time the small movement at the corner of his mouth stayed longer, and she understood, without either of them saying so, that the conversation had shifted quietly into another key. They spoke, for the rest of the 6th course and through the 7th, about small things, about books he had read and books she had read and the one book they had both read and disagreed about the bridge in the north, about a road in the south that needed mending, about the way a house learns the shape of its inhabitants over 100 years, and about the way its inhabitants, in turn, are shaped by it. They did not speak of the dead again. They did not speak of Cassia, who at the middle of the table was laughing too brightly at something the abbot had not said, or of Marin, who was watching them with the still, dark attention of a cat at a mousehole. They spoke, instead, quietly, at their end of the polished table, and the candles burned down, and Perrin under the tablecloth fell asleep with his cheek against Wren's slipper, and the rain thinned. And somewhere in the middle of the 7th course Wren realized that she had, for the first time in 11 years at Ashenford, been fully at a table. The banquet ended, as banquets do, without any of the parties saying openly what had happened at it. The Duke rose. Uncle Osric rose. The hall rose. There were bows, and there were curtsies, and there was talk of an early departure in the morning, and Aunt Heloise, whose composure had returned in the last 2 courses, because composure was the only weapon she had never allowed herself to lose, saw the Duke to the great door with the smile of a woman who has decided to reinterpret the evening on her own terms by breakfast. The Duke, at the door, he turned to Wren, who had come forward to make her 3rd curtsy of the night, and he said quietly, "Until the morning." She said, "Until the morning, Your Grace." He bowed. He went. The hall emptied slowly. Cassia did not look at Wren. Marin did, once, a long, slow look that Wren returned levelly, and then Marin turned away. Aunt Heloise, passing Wren on her way to the stair, said in a voice pitched only for her ear that she hoped Wren understood how gracious the Duke had been, and how easily gracious might be mistaken for particular, and that a girl of her age and her situation would be wise not to entertain fancies. Wren said, evenly, that she entertained no fancies. Aunt Heloise looked at her for a moment, and something in her face, some small, unwilling thing moved, she said. "Well," she said, "sleep then." She went up. Wren did not go up. She walked, instead, to the north hearth, where Perrin had by then been carried up by a maid, and she stood for a long moment looking into the low red heart of the fire. She thought about her mother, whom she barely remembered, and about her father, whom she remembered more. She thought about the small wooden box that had come with her at 9, and about the letter her father had written the night before he died, and about the 11 years of quiet arithmetic she had done in this house, without anyone thinking to add her up. She thought about the Duke's gray eyes, and about the shape of the offer he had made her, which was not the offer any woman in Aunt Heloise's world would recognize, but which was, she understood clearly, the only offer she had ever been made that was addressed to what she actually was. She thought about it for a long time. Then she went up the stair, quietly, and she went along the corridor of the west wing, and she opened the door of her own room. The candle on the table had burned down to nothing. She lit another. She took off the silver-green gown, and she laid it across the trunk with more care than she had ever laid a gown, and she looked, for a moment, at the spray of silver leaves on the shoulder, and she thought about the plum that had been there that afternoon and was not there now. She thought, quietly, well, it broke then, the thing she had held for 11 years. It did not break loudly. It broke the way certain long-held things break, which is quietly, in a small room, without witness. She sat down on the edge of the bed in her shift, and she put her hands over her face, and she did not weep exactly, but her shoulders moved once, twice, 3 times, and then were still, and when she took her hands down her eyes were wet, and her mouth was steady. She thought, again, of Perrin's question, "Are you afraid?" She thought, tonight, no. She thought tomorrow, perhaps a little. She thought, either way. In the morning, she rose early. She dressed in her plainest gown, because the silver green belonged now to a different evening and would keep. She braided her hair as she had braided it the night before. and she went down through the still sleeping house to the small parlor where the light came in from the east, and she sat at the little writing table there, and she took a clean sheet of paper and she wrote her answer. She wrote it in the even, small, clear hand she had taught herself at 15 from her uncle's ledgers. She wrote that she accepted the work. She wrote that she would be ready to travel at whatever date and by whatever means His Grace thought proper. She wrote that she asked one condition, which was that a small pension be settled out of her first year's wage on her cousin Perrin, 6 years old, for the purchase of his schooling, because a house that had not thought to feed him his supper could not be trusted to think of his letters. She signed her name. She folded the paper. She sealed it with a plain wafer. She rose. She walked through the still sleeping house to the great door, where a groom of Isilmarez was already at the horses in the wet gray of the yard, and she placed the folded paper in his hand and asked him, courteously, to give it to His Grace before he rode. He said he would. He looked at her once, curiously, and then, catching himself, he bowed. She bowed back. She went inside. She stood in the doorway of the great hall for a moment, looking down its length at the polished table where the servants were already at work clearing the last of the night, and she thought, quietly, of the seat at its head where he had drawn out the chair for her, and of the 72 candles, and of the small warm weight of Perrin against her slipper. Then she turned, and she went up the stair to her own room, to wait for the morning to become the day, and for the day to become the beginning of a life she had, without ever quite believing it possible, been building for 11 years in the dark. There is a certain kind of morning in early autumn when the light comes in low across a wet yard and turns everything it touches to silver, and it was on such a morning, a week later, that Wren left Ashenford. She left in a plain traveling gown and a warm cloak, with the small wooden box that had come with her at 9 tied again in twine, and with a leather-bound ledger of her own, unmarked yet, given to her by the Duke's steward the day before. She left by the courtyard door, not the great one. Uncle Osric came down to see her off, and he took her hand awkwardly and said, well, and then, more quietly, thank you. And Wren understood that he had been told, in whatever terms the Duke had chosen, that the house had been saved, and that he had not been told, in any terms at all. By whom? She let him have that. She said, Uncle, and pressed his hand and let it go. Aunt Heloise did not come down. Cassia did not come down. Marin, unexpectedly, did. She came down in her dressing gown, with her dark hair loose down her back, and she stood in the doorway of the courtyard and watched Wren tie the twine of her box, and when Wren looked up she said, quietly, was it you? Wren said, was what me? Marin said, the plum. Wren waited. Marin said, I mean, was it you who mended it? Wren said yes. Marin looked at her for a long moment, and something in her dark eyes moved, and she said, I did not know you could do that. Wren said no. She said it without malice. Marin said, cousin, she said, take care. Wren said, and you. Marin went inside. Perrin came last. He came running, barefoot again, in his nightshirt again, with his wooden horse in one hand and, in the other, a small folded square of paper. He thrust the paper at her without a word. Wren opened it. It was a drawing, done in the wobbling ink of a 6-year-old, of a woman in a gown with a branch on her shoulder, standing next to a tall man, and under the tablecloth of the drawn table there was a small round shape, unmistakable, of a boy eating a piece of pheasant. Wren looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she knelt, in the wet of the yard, and she took Perrin's face in her hands, and she said, I will write to you every week. He said, promise. She said, promise, he said, and you will come back. She said, "I will come back," he said, she said, "when your letters are as long as mine." He considered this, and nodded gravely, and stepped back and stood very straight and did not cry. Wren rose. She got into the carriage. The groom of Iselmarie shut the door. The horses moved. She looked back once, through the small window, and she saw Ashenford as she had never quite seen it before, gray and wet and smaller than she remembered, with a barefoot boy in a nightshirt standing very straight in the courtyard, holding up a wooden horse in salute. She lifted her hand to the window. He lifted his. The carriage turned the corner of the gatehouse, and Ashenford was gone. She sat back against the seat. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought about the ledger under her cloak, and about the honest steward who would arrive at Ashenford in the spring, and about the bailiff who would be replaced, and about the small pension that would be settled, quietly and irrevocably, on a 6-year-old boy's letters. She thought about the Duke of Iselmarie, whom she would see again by evening at the small manor 2 days' ride south, where his consortium kept its northern accounts, and where a room and a desk and a first year's worth of work were already waiting for her. She thought about him without hurry and without any of the fluttering that Aunt Heloise had warned her against. She thought, he asked. She thought, no one has asked. She thought, we will see. She looked out at the low silver light on the fields, and the yellowing hedges, and the crows lifting off in threes from the wet stubble, and she counted, out of habit, to 3. And then she smiled, very slightly, at herself, and stopped counting. She did not need to. Her hands were not shaking. As for the rest of them, in the small way that stories have of tidying their edges, Uncle Osric, given 3 good years and an honest man at his ledgers, learned late in life to be less proud of what he had not earned and more proud of what he was quietly permitted to keep. He lived to see his son Perrin sent to a good school in the south, at a cost he never quite understood, and died in his own bed of a chill he refused to admit to, saying only, at the end, that he had not deserved half his luck, which was the truest thing he had ever said. Aunt Heloise, presented at last with the arithmetic of her own house, reinterpreted the events of that autumn for the rest of her life as a piece of her own strategy, and told the story often, and no one ever quite dared to correct her, though the servants smiled into their aprons. Cassia married, within the year, a young viscount with more temper than title, and was, by all accounts, exactly as happy as she had planned to be. Marin did not marry for a long time. She read, instead. She read her father's ledgers, quietly, in the small hours when the house was sleeping, and she wrote, once, a letter to her cousin Wren, asking a question about interest on a certain debt, and Wren wrote back, and they wrote, after that, sometimes, and became, in the slow way of women who have wronged each other and grown, something almost like friends. Perrin grew tall. He kept the wooden horse. He became, in time, a lawyer of unusual patience and unfashionable honesty, and he never in his life sat down to a table without first looking, from habit, to see whether there was a small, hungry person under it who needed feeding. The bailiff was replaced. The debt was paid, in the manner Wren had proposed, over 3 good years. The Duke of Iselmarie, who had come to Ashenford in the wet autumn of a certain year to look at a house that owed him 2,000 crowns, and had left it having given away rather more than he came with, went on with the running of Iselmarie, with the same quiet competence that had surprised those who had expected a second son's carelessness. In the spring, he asked Wren, over a set of accounts in a room that smelled of applewood and warmth, whether she would consider staying at Iselmarie in a capacity that was not, strictly, that of a steward. She looked up from the accounts. She said, in the even, small, clear voice she used for such things, yes, she said it without hesitation, because there was, in that moment, no hesitation in her. And there was, on the shoulder of the plain dark gown she was wearing that day, a small, almost invisible, embroidered branch in silver, worked by her own hand, on which a single bud had opened. And now, my friend by the fire, that is where I leave them, and where I leave you. If you have ever, in a house that did not quite see you, sat quietly and done your work and taught yourself in the dark the things no one thought to teach you, and if you have ever wondered whether anyone would ever look at you twice and see what was there, this story was for you. I hope it sat softly against you tonight. I hope, when the candles go down and the fire settles, you remember the moment that stayed with you most. Perhaps the plum on the shoulder of a borrowed gown, or a small boy under a tablecloth, or a tall man asking a question no one had thought to ask. Tell me, when you next come by the hearth, which one it was. Bring your cup. Bring your quiet. There will be another story, and another chair drawn up, and the fire will be kept for you. Until then, sleep gently, and travel kindly, and remember, if you remember nothing else, that some of the finest embroidery in this world is done by candlelight, in small rooms, by hands no one is watching. Good night.